Welcome once again to Dialogue on Public Issues. I'm John Chowning with Campbellsville University. Today I'm very pleased to be interviewing the Honorable Mike Harmon, our Kentucky State Auditor. Mr. Harmon, welcome.
Good to see you. Appreciate you having me here.
Welcome to Campbellsville.
It's great. Always great being in Campbellsville.
Well, it's a pretty good town.
It is a good town.
And you're not too far away from Campbellsville.
No,
just an hour away, maybe?
It's just about an hour. And although my wife doesn't go here, she does go to Campbellsville University, the Harrodsburg.
Well, we're very pleased to have her as a student.
Yes.
At the Harrodsburg Center. Tell us a little bit about yourself. As I said, you're the state auditor, but you've done some other things in life before that time.
Sure. Well, I graduated at Boyle County High School as valedictorian. I went on to Eastern Kentucky University, where I graduated with a triple major in math, statistics, and theater.
Oh, my.
I jokingly tell people
interesting.
Well, thank you. Well, I jokingly tell people that that way I know the math, I know the statistics. What I don't know, I just act like I know. So just a joke. It is just a joke.
Right.
Of course, I'm married to my lovely wife, Lynn, who, as I said, is going to Campbellsville right now, kind of a bucket list thing for her. We've got two beautiful daughters, Tori and Lizzie. We've got son-in-law Ma. We've got two wonderful grandkids, Aiden and Silas, and so we're just truly blessed. I served in the Kentucky General Assembly for 13 years prior to being elected Kentucky State Auditor. Had a couple of defeats. I ran in 1998 and lost, in 2000 and lost, and then I also ran for Lieutenant Governor in 2011 and lost. And of course, whenever I was talking to the kids and everything, when they came up, I would always ask them, have any of y'all played basketball or baseball or anything, had a loss? And they would like, yes. I said, did you quit? And they was like, no. And it's like, well, that's kind of like life. You take those defeats, you learn from them, and you keep moving forward.
Why did you decide to run for state auditor?
Well, I ran in 2011 as Lieutenant Governor, and that was kind of an interesting story anyway, because I had thought I was going to run statewide, and I had prayed about it and talked to a couple of people, couldn't get a direction, and finally just, told God, said, if you want me to run, you're going to have to make it as clear, because right now it's clear as mud. And about 2 weeks later, someone called and asked me to run for their Lieutenant Governor. Well, as I said, I lost that one. But I thought in 2015 maybe I should run statewide again. Kept praying about it, couldn't get a clear direction on it, and finally I actually thought I was going to run for Secretary of State, because I had served on elections, constitutional amendments, intergovernmental affairs in the House, and never could get a clear direction. And then we ended up having one of our gubernatorial candidates came through and said we need a good auditor. Now, he didn't say me, he said we need a good auditor. And I had another one of my friends who actually went on to be state rep after me. He said, you need to run statewide again. And so I prayed about it, and that door seemed to open, and I stepped through.
Now, what is the responsibility of the state auditor?
Sure. Well, the state auditor is actually an executive position, because I've had people ask me, are you a CPA, are you an accountant? And no, I myself am not, but now my assistant state auditor definitely has to be. But we do about 600 audits per year. The role of the state auditor himself, I do final review of a lot of the audits, or of the audits. Take a look at that, but we coordinate, especially for like non-merit staff. Merit staff, that's a little different pathway there, but for the non-merit, the executive staff, we review that. And then of course, we just stay busy providing direction. We've got a lot of audits that we just do statutorily, like your fiscal courts and your sheriffs and your county clerks. So the auditor has some things that he has to do, just based on that. But we also have, some opportunity to do some special exams and things like that. We get tips, and I always tell everybody, if you have any tips, you can go to auditor.ky.gov or 1-800-KY-ALERT. A lot of times we'll look through those tips and see if there's, something that we need to do a special exam on. Or a lot of times we get requests, from state agencies, from secretaries within it, then we review those, and if we have the staffing, then we try to make a decision if we want to move forward with it.
How large is the staff of the auditor's office?
Right now, we've got about 135. It runs 134, 135. About half of those are out in the counties, and about half of them are there in Frankfort.
Now, it is a constitutional office.
It is a constitutional office.
So you're elected every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
You were first elected in 2015.
Yes.
And you mentioned this, but more specifically, the audits you are required to perform
Right.
By law or by constitution on an annual basis or biennial basis.
Yeah, we do, of course, we do, as I said, the fiscal courts. Now, we have for like the fiscal courts, we have right of first refusal to do those. We typically like to do fiscal court once every 4 years.
Okay.
They have to have what we call a financial statement audit every year. But a lot of times if they request, we will allow them to get a CPA, maybe a local CPA, except for that 1 in 4 years that we like to take. We still end up reviewing that work,
Right.
but we allow them to get a CPA to do that. Sheriffs and county clerks, we audit those every year. Now we did, not this session, but the 2018 session, we worked with the General Assembly to pass Senate Bill 144, which is what we call our AUP bill, agreed upon procedure. So like our sheriffs and our county clerks, in the event that they have a clean audit the year before, instead of doing a full-blown financial statement audit for their fee accounts, we can actually do an agreed upon procedure. And why that's important, one, most of those audits are low risk, and so it actually helps us save them 25 to 50% on the cost of their audit. So we do that. We also do what's known as the statewide single audit of Kentucky, Volume 1, Volume 2. Volume 1 typically looks at how state dollars are spent. Volume 2 typically looks at how federal dollars are spent. And then, so we stay very busy.
Sounds like it, no doubt. Now, I looked at your website as prepared for this interview, and you've recently issued several
Yes.
audits, statewide consequence, and I just was going to go down the list and let you mention, just for
Sure.
our audience to have some idea
Right.
of some of the findings and just the scope,
Yes.
the very significant scope of what you're doing in your office. One is the audit of the state's fiscal year 2018 budget.
Yeah,
You mentioned that.
And that's what we refer to the SWAC. We call it the statewide single audit, but
Right.
the SWAC Volume 1 and Volume 2. We had on Volume 1, we had things like there was 1.5 billion in errors, about 300, I think it was a little over 300 million of that dealt with both the pensions and post-pension benefits. Some of the stuff that kind of leaps out, sometimes those things, what you think will not leap out as much leaps out, like some of the stuff that leaped out in that one, COT, the Office of Technology, they basically had 2,000 servers that didn't have backed up properly, so that kind of leaped out after some of the discussion about the salaries,
Right.
COT. And then the one that we thought would get a little more press but didn't, Kentucky Horse Park, was actually paying for Spindletop's water and sewer. Now they were getting some reimbursement on it, but they didn't have a proper contract in place, and it was just kind of an odd setup they had on their Volume 2. Some of the stuff that we looked at, the Kentucky Department of Military Affairs, they were basically invoicing on a FEMA grant from 2009, back to the ice storm. I don't know if you remember the
Yes,
ice storm,
I do.
but we
Sure
were
do.
out of power about 10 days during that time, but they were still invoicing on some of those. So there was some, we questioned some of the cost on that. I think it was a little over 30,000 we questioned. And then also there was like KDE, Kentucky Department of Education, had drawn down an additional like 1.3 million for like an after-school grants that they did not administer. Now I think they've since, according to their information, have went in and administered it, but they were supposed to wait until they have reimbursement request and draw that down. Now they didn't. It wasn't misappropriated.
Right,
It was just
right.
it was drawn down and stuck in a non-interest-bearing account. But those are supposed to get out in a more timely fashion.
So most of those kinds of findings are just procedural errors, or
A lot of times.
is
A lot of
that
times. Sometimes you'll find stuff, but of course, on the statewide, we really haven't seen as much. We would think of like criminal or referable
Right.
items. Now in the counties, we've had some of those items that we referred.
Now there was an audit I think you did of Kentucky's indebtedness.
Yes. Now, in that particular one, it really wasn't what like an accountant would call an audit.
Right. Okay.
It was more of what we have tried to do, and we've released 2 of these. We've done what we call data bulletins.
Okay.
And there's so much information out there that's available to everybody, but
Right.
trying to get it distilled down
Exactly.
in a usable, where the average individual can understand. Because we're all so busy. I mean, everybody's
Exactly.
working, trying to stay hard. Well, that particular one we distilled down to about 11 page on our debt bulletin. And what we found was there was about 54, I think it was 54.6 billion in debt about 80% of that was the unfunded pension liability. I think it was like 43.3 billion. Well, if you take that 54.6 billion and you divide it by every man, woman, and child in the state of Kentucky, it ends up being like $12,300 for every man, woman, and child in the state of Kentucky. Before I leave, I'll get your check.
Oh,
so,
well,
no,
okay. I forgot my checkbook.
Oh, well, all right. Well,
You send me a bill.
send you a bill. You know, the other thing we talked about, we talked a little bit about our bond rating and our credit rating in that regards. And, you know, unfortunately of the surrounding states, thankfully we don't have the lowest, but we have the next to lowest.
Okay.
Thank goodness for Illinois. So they are the lowest. So
We're no longer saying thank goodness for other states.
exactly,
Yeah, now
exactly.
Illinois.
Yes, Illinois in that regards. So we've got our work ahead of us, and from the standpoint of the General Assembly and the
So
governor.
the bonded, our pension issues are causing problems with our bond ratings.
Yes,
And obviously,
yes.
the lower our bond rating, the higher
Our interest rate.
interest
we pay.
rate will be,
Yes, exactly.
because they're riskier, at least to
Yes.
the
And
bond
it's,
rating agencies.
it's problematic. They're trying to address it. I know the governor and the current General Assembly over the last 3 years has put more money into the pension systems than the previous governor did in the last 8. So that's good to see, but unfortunately they've still got a long way to go.
People that are watching maybe or listening on radio may think, well, we thought Kentucky had to have a balanced budget, so why do we have all this debt? You've explained 43 billion of it.
Right.
It's the long-term shortfall for our projected liabilities. Where's the rest of this debt? Is it through bond issues and so forth?
We've got it, if you go to auditor.ky.gov, we've got it broken down in more. The rest of it, you know, the 20% of it is, you know, different types of bonding. Some of them are actual bonding, you know, to build roads and bridges and things like that. Some of them are actually things that are not paid for by the General Assembly, but still, you know, have the faith and credit of the Kentucky, or Kentucky. Things like Kentucky Housing Corporation, they have, I forgot how many, you know, billions of dollars in bonds, but they end up, you know, producing revenue and ultimately paying for it.
In theory, at least the Commonwealth could potentially, if the revenue assigned didn't come through.
Exactly.
Okay. You did an audit, I believe, of Kentucky's retirement systems.
We did. We do statutorily once every. Now they have a financial statement audit every year, but we, as the auditor's office, are required to do a financial statement audit once every 5 years. So we did one of KRS, a Kentucky Retirement System, and part of it we saw there was about 2.37 million. That was overpayments. The employers had overpaid, which basically what that meant was that your employees probably had overpaid and needed to get some refunds. So we noticed they didn't really have a good setup to get that money back to the employees. We also noticed there was about 104,000 that they overpaid. I'm sorry, that they waived in penalties. The system waived in penalties, and we weren't really sure. We couldn't find where they had the authority to actually waive those penalties, you know, especially without notifying the board. So there were some things. The other thing we did is we mentioned, in addition, of course, you know, there's several retirement systems. KRS, which has multiple ones underneath of it. There's also the legislative judicial retirement system, and then there's KTRS, which is the teacher's retirement system. Well, what the financial statement audit we did this year was, or I guess it was technically last year, was KRS, but we're also doing a special exam that covers all of them, which includes the Senate Bill 2 compliance feature. We haven't wrapped that up just yet, but
that will be for all the systems, or all the retirement
yes, but
systems.
it won't be a financial statement audit. It'll be an audit on certain specific areas. The largest part of it will be Senate Bill 2 compliance from a couple of years ago. Yeah.
The Kentucky retirement system, KRS, state employees, that's the one that's the
biggest trouble.
Yeah.
But now under KRS, there's like 5 different ones. There's KERS, hazardous and non-hazardous. There is the CERS, which is the county ones, hazardous, non-hazardous, and then the state police. And there's some of those subcomponents are the ones that are the at least. KERS non-hazardous, I think, is like at 12 or 13%, at the time that we're speaking. So
you did some work on audit of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife that has received some press and coverage.
We did. The biggest problem that we found at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, there was kind of a pervasive attitude that it wasn't government money. It wasn't the people's money. They basically would say, and even had in some of their literature, that no funds were from general fund appropriation. What they didn't tell you was in those type of documents was that, well, they basically have a monopoly on issuing the licenses and things like that. Plus, they also got federal dollars, which is still taxpayers' dollars. So that was one of the things that we pointed out. They used, there's a separate foundation, and they used some of the foundation to circumvent some of the procurement laws, including, it may sound small, but purchasing $750 worth of alcohol, that's not permitted, with state dollars, or the public funds, not permitted for public funds. We also had a situation where there was, I think it was like 2008 to, it's like 5 or 6 years, that they had expended like $550,000 to try to promote ducks, getting ducks to come to Kentucky, and they really didn't monitor that very well. When we went back and looked at it as if, based on the data we saw, only about 10% of the migrant ducks came, from that area of Canada. There were some other areas of Canada, so we had some questions. There was more than that. I think there was 11 findings total, but that was some of the highlights.
And that agency has had some other issues that we won't delve into. Some
they
hiring
have had
practices
some issues, and we were actually asked,
and so forth.
And that was one of the ones where the secretary actually asked us to go in and take a look at it, and we did. So
the Kentucky Wired Project, the broadband project.
I tell you what, the Kentucky Wire is the one that kind of broke my heart the most. You had a situation where Congressman Rogers did a good thing, appropriated $23 million to try to get high-speed internet into eastern Kentucky. You had then Governor Beshear wanted to do it statewide, and what they were laying, they weren't actually laying to the house. They were doing what they call the middle mile. So they appropriated $30 million for that, and then they did RFP, which is a request for proposal. But under that RFP, it was supposed to be a P3, public-private partnership. Prior to there was even public-private partnership legislation. So the sole bidder on that was a company by the name of Macquarie, and they're an Australian company, and they were supposed to take on all the risk, pole attachments, things like that. They were also supposed to get private funding. Where somewhere between that original RFP and response, and when they signed the project agreement about 9 months later in September, just right before Governor Beshear leaves office, they flipped the script, and they ended up using tax-free bonds, which basically tied it to our credit rating, which we talked about had some problems anyway. Did that, and then they also took on the risk of the pole attachments with unrealistic timelines. So they were in default almost immediately paying these supervening events. So they flipped the script from a $30 million obligation to $1.5 billion with a B total obligation over 30 years of what they call availability payments, but it's on a network that still as of yet is not available. The other thing that they did, there was warnings. A lot of what they were basing on doing this is moving where the government was paying to a private sector, company, move that to this particular line. So, well, 45% of that revenue they were counting on was something called E-rates. And what E-rates is your local schools receive federal dollars for a lot of different things, but one of them is for their internet, providing internet. So they were counting on 45% of their revenue. I think it was a little over $540 million over that period. Well, they were warned that they probably couldn't get that because that has to be, since it's federal dollars, it had to be competitive bidding. And there were a couple of other aspects, but they were warned like 2 or 3 times, but they decided, under Governor Beshear, they decided to go ahead and do that. And then as it turned out, they didn't get that. So there's like a huge hole in this project that hasn't even been completed as of yet. So, and of course, Governor Bevin has struggled to try to get it, as he called it, a bag of parts given, try to figure out how to put it together and get it moving. So there's a lot of concern. But
they're still out there, they're still functioning, but lots of question marks.
Well, they're still trying, but as of yet, they're about 1.5 years behind. When we did our audit, there was about $80 million, $88 million in supervening events. The governor's office asked for $110 million to try to clean that up and have a little bit of extra, and even that $88 million didn't include like a 24 million in easement concerns at the time of our audit. Well, they had since this last session came back and tried to ask for a little bit more money, and so the legislators were very concerned because they'd kind of been,
Has anyone actually received service yet from
no,
that project? I didn't think so.
No. They've laid about 1,000 miles of line, but as of yet nothing. And the crazy thing about it is that original $23 million grant that Congressman Rogers secured, it was subject to there actually being the internet available. So it hasn't been. So they haven't actually drawn down that 23.5 million. But the way they wrote the project agreement, they've been paying interest on that 23.5 million that they haven't received.
Oh, wow.
So the whole thing, I encourage you to go to auditor.ky.gov and pull it up and take a look at it. I mean, I'm just really scratching the surface of some of the stuff that we found here, in a 30-minute conversation.
And the best of intentions with, everybody was cheering for the project, and it was considered innovative and so forth at that time.
Yeah, they were cheering for it. I think the biggest concern that I had is, when they flipped the script, they did it kind of under the cloak of dark. They did it when they knew they had warnings that they were going to have this big hole, that they needed to fill before they proceeded with it. And it was just, basically with one signature.
Right.
So that's my biggest concern, that we were left with this problem. And my guess is if they had gone back and rebid it, because they kind of went out, they did go outside of the original procurement and probably violated some procurement laws. But if they'd gone back and rebid that the way that they ended up giving it to Macquarie, my guess is you'd have not 4 or 5 Kentucky companies bid on it the way that they had set it up. So they didn't do that. And the other thing is, if they had gone back and process worked with like your co-ops and your telecoms and things like that, a lot of them who had the poles, and especially your co-ops had poles going directly to the house. Not only could they have worked to lay that middle mile, but you could have also ended up getting it to their house. Getting it to their house. And if you notice, there's a couple of other states that have taken our audit and have actually tried to do it better, and working with co-ops and the telecoms and setting up incentives so that they have learned from our mistake.
This comment I'm going to make is based strictly on reports prior to your audit.
Sure.
But as I understand, this company has had performance problems in other places as well.
Yeah, now the interesting thing, this same company worked with Indiana, as I understand, had worked with Indiana when they sold their toll roads. But what they did different there, and maybe this is where they learned, what they did different there, they did it the way they originally bid it, in that they took on the risk, and it was, it impacted them significantly, but it didn't impact the state, because the state didn't put their bond rating at risk.
How do you assure that compliance when you have findings in an audit?
Right.
What steps and measures do you take, your staff take, to assure that those findings are done?
Well, we're a reporting agency, so we're not an enforcement agency. We find the data, we confirm the data, we report the data. And of course, I tell all our staff, the moment I walked in, we even got a little button we put together with it, but I told all our staff, we don't target anyone, we don't give anybody a pass, we just simply follow the data. So it's kind of our follow the data. But now, if data rises to the level, we can refer that to, we've referred some to the Attorney General, we've referred some to the FBI. Sometimes if it's just an ethics violation, we feel referred to that. So that's kind of how we hold people accountable. Now, like on our special exams, in addition to their initial comment that's we allow to be included in our exam, they generally can have additional comment in 60 days, how the process of what they're doing. But we can't necessarily force them to do it. Now, our fiscal courts and our sheriffs and county clerks, if we have a finding one year, when we come back and audit the next year, we can see if they have made the proper adjustments or requested adjustment in that regards. And most of them do. Most people we deal with, are good, honest individuals that want to do the right thing, that want to be compliant with the laws, and they work with us. You get some that aren't. We've had some major ones come through. I know Port Jackson County, they had their former treasurer had written herself about $114,000 in checks, or at least what we determined, $114,000. So we'd referred that to the FBI. As it turned out, when the FBI got in there, they found some more. So I think it ended up being like 162,000 by the time it was done. And I believe she's just recently pled guilty. So I think she'll be sentenced here in the next couple of months.
One of the things I've noticed through the years that's pretty common, and particularly in small counties, with the sheriff's office or county clerk's office, is in terms of internal control, financial control.
Internal control.
You have just a very limited staff, and they have to do dual functions and so forth. And there's standard procedures that you have to, your auditors have to cite.
And the one that we cite a lot is something called lack of segregation of duties.
Exactly.
And some staff will take that, or some counties will take that lightly. A lot of them understand, and they work hard to try to get it resolved with compensating controls, double people, and then checking. But that lack of segregation of duties, where you can, if you've got something that's a person that's 100% honest, it may never impact you financially. But what happens is everybody needs somebody looking over their shoulder. So if you get somebody that maybe is perfectly honest normally, but maybe they get a sick child, maybe they develop a drug habit, maybe they, unfortunately develop a gambling habit. If no one's looking over their shoulder and temptation is there, temptation and opportunity, they go ahead and take it. And that's where the biggest risk is. But it's also the one that a lot of people consider the least. And that's one of the reasons we push for Senate Bill 144 to give people an incentive to try to clean all that up. So that, plus the other thing with Senate Bill 144, it allows us to take auditors off low risk and put them on more high risk audits. So.
We're out of time.
Oh,
I've
really?
enjoyed the conversation and
Me
the
too.
interview. We'll have to do this again soon.
I really appreciate it.
We wish you the very best and Godspeed
Thank you.
as you travel and as you fulfill your constitutional statutory duties.
Thank you.
Mike Harmon, Kentucky State Auditor, our guest today for Dialogue on Public Issues, and we appreciate our loyal audience, both via TV and radio. Thank you for Dialogue on Public Issues.